I want to ask you something most people get completely wrong. When did humans start going to war? Most people picture armies, castles, maybe ancient Rome, maybe Mesopotamia. But the real answer is so much older than that, and so much darker. Because the first evidence of organized human violence doesn't come from a civilization. It comes from hunter-gatherers, living in small bands, thousands of years before anyone built a single wall. By the way, no AI here. This video is the result of days of research. I know a lot of channels do it differently. This one doesn't. Just wanted to be upfront with you. Let's go back to one of the most important discoveries in this entire field. A place called Jebel Sahaba, in modern-day Sudan, right on the border with Egypt. In the 1960s, archaeologists found a cemetery there, 61 skeletons. For decades, this was considered the oldest evidence of warfare ever found. In 2021, scientists re-examined every single bone using modern microscopic analysis, and what they found was disturbing. A quarter of the skeletons showed both healed and unhealed wounds, which means these weren't people who died in one single battle. These were people who had been attacked, survived, and then attacked again, multiple times, over the course of their lives. Most of the injuries came from projectile weapons, spears, arrows. This site is now dated to around 13,400 years ago. So this wasn't a single war. It was something worse. Ongoing, repeated violence between groups. For generations, and researchers believe they know why. Around that time, the climate was changing dramatically. Resources were becoming scarce. When food and water start running out, competition between groups intensifies, and competition eventually turns violent. Now let's jump forward a few thousand years, to a site that might be even more brutal. Naturuk, Kenya, near Lake Turkana. In 2012, researchers found the remains of 27 people, including children, including a pregnant woman. The injuries were horrifying. Skulls smashed with blunt weapons, hands and knees bound, sharp obsidian spear tips still lodged inside two of the skeletons. This dates back roughly 1,000 years. And here's the part that really surprised researchers. These people weren't farmers defending land. They weren't part of an organized civilization. They were hunter-gatherers. The kind of society we used to assume was too small, too mobile, too peaceful for war. So what does this tell us? For a long time, many anthropologists believed that warfare was something that came later in human history, that it was a side effect of agriculture, of settling down, of owning property worth fighting over. But Naturuk challenges that idea directly. It suggests that organized group violence might predate farming, might predate permanent settlements entirely, which raises an uncomfortable question. Is this something we invented, or is it something we inherited? To answer that, scientists didn't just look at ancient bones. They looked at our closest living relatives, chimpanzees. In the 1970s, primatologist Jane Goodall was studying a chimpanzee community in Gombe National Park, Tanzania. She watched something no one had ever documented before. The community split into two rival groups, and over the next 4 years, the stronger group hunted down and ended the lives of every single male in the other group, one by one. This became known as the Gombe Chimpanzee War. At first, many scientists refused to believe it. They assumed Goodall's presence had somehow caused unnatural behavior, but later studies on multiple chimpanzee communities across Africa confirmed the same pattern: coordinated raids, patrols along territorial borders, targeted attacks against rival males. This wasn't random aggression. It had structure. It had strategy. It looked uncomfortably similar to human warfare. But here's where it gets more complicated. Because chimpanzees aren't the only close relative we have. There's also the bonobo. Bonobos share almost the exact same DNA as chimpanzees. They live in similar forests. Similar group sizes, similar social structures. But here's the difference. In the wild, organized violence between bonobo groups has essentially never been documented. No coordinated attacks, no territorial wars. When two bonobo groups run into each other, instead of fighting, they often do something completely different. They mingle, they share food, they spend time together, sometimes for days. Scientists call this the make love not war species. And for a long time, that comparison shaped how we thought about human nature itself. If chimpanzees represent our violent side, maybe bonobos represent the road not taken. Proof that things didn't have to go this way. Now, more recent research has pushed back on this a little. Newer studies suggest bonobos aren't perfectly peaceful either. There's still aggression within their own groups. So the old violent chimp versus peaceful bonobo story might be a bit too simple. But the core finding still stands: organized, large-scale violence between groups. The kind we see in chimpanzees, and the kind we see in our own ancient ancestors, has never been observed in bonobos. Which means whatever pulls a species toward war isn't just being a great ape. Something else has to trigger it. This is sometimes called the goodness paradox. Humans are capable of horrific, organized violence in war, but we're also capable of building enormous, cooperative societies with millions of strangers who never raise a hand against each other. Both of these things live inside the same species, at the same time. So here's the bigger picture forming. If our closest animal relatives engage in organized, extreme group violence, and if some of the oldest human skeletons we've ever found show repeated, sustained attacks, then maybe war isn't something that started with kings or empires or borders on a map. Maybe it's something much older, wired into group-living primates, long before any of that existed. And there's one more piece to this puzzle. After agriculture appears in the archaeological record, the evidence for warfare doesn't slow down. It actually gets clearer, more frequent, more organized. Once people had permanent land, stored grain, livestock, and houses, they suddenly had a lot more worth defending, and a lot more worth fighting over. Some researchers think this is when war, as we recognize it today, truly took shape. Not invented from nothing, but scaled up, organized, turned into something with leaders, strategy, and repeated campaigns instead of scattered raids. So maybe the real story isn't that farming invented war. Maybe farming just gave war something it never had before. A reason to get bigger. Now. Not everyone agrees on what this all means. Some researchers argue that population density is the real key, that when resources are abundant and groups expand into each other's territory, conflict becomes almost inevitable, not because we're inherently violent, but because competition for survival is. Others push back even further, arguing that sites like Jebel Sahaba show episodes of violence rather than full-scale war, and that we should be careful applying a modern word like war to small-scale prehistoric conflict. It's still debated, genuinely. Researchers who study hunter-gatherer societies, still living today, have found something similar. Violence rates vary enormously from one group to another. Some groups report almost no conflict in living memory. Others report frequent raids, which suggests there isn't one single hardwired human destiny. There's a range, and where any particular group lands on that range seems to depend heavily on circumstance, resources, climate, population pressure, history. But what almost everyone agrees on is this: the seeds of organized violence go back far earlier than most of us were ever taught. So let's bring this all together. 13,400 years ago, in Jebel Sahaba, humans were already locked in repeated, sustained conflict. 10,000 years ago, in Nataruk, an entire hunter-gatherer group was wiped out in a single brutal attack. And in our closest living relatives, the same pattern of coordinated, deadly group violence still plays out today. This isn't a story about castles or kings. It's a story about something that may be written much deeper into us than that. 4x_. So I'll leave you with this. If war really does go back this far, before farming, before cities, before any of the things we usually blame it on, then maybe the real question isn't when did humans start fighting wars? Maybe it's what would it actually take for us to stop? Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you land on this. See you in the next one. Bye.